remember that first moment when we realized that we could read. I had a governess who would read to me when I was 2 or 3, and I was longing to be able to capture the stories on the page on my own. One day, from a car, I don't remember where we were going, but outside the window was a billboard, and suddenly the letters on the billboard meant something to me. I felt I was a magician. I could read. Now, not everyone, of course, is as fortunate as I was. All sorts of impediments, poverty, politics, and even our own body disallows us from this magic act.
My name is Alberto Manguel. All my life I've been a reader. And now, after having lived in many parts of the world and after having spent decades in Canada, I live in France, surrounded by my books. In them, I can trace the reader's journey through history, a journey that entails this most human of creative acts.
Should have taken on this road. If you never wanted to be a witness, then you never should have let your heart grow cold. Sing, sing and let your heart be free. Sing and let your soul be free.
James Bartleman, the former Lieutenant Governor of Ontario,
Bonjour.
Is a man on a singular mission.
Bonjour. Come and sit down beside me. Books have always been very important to me. Have you ever had a chance to read yourself?
Yeah, a little bit.
A little bit?
Yeah.
And what books have you read?
Anything.
Anything?
Yeah.
Okay. Smart grandmother.
Yeah.
I am a big believer in reading because for me it was a chance to get away from, you know, a hard life to a life of doing things that I really could only dream about.
Bartleman has been running a massive literacy campaign in dozens of Native communities across northern Ontario. He believes that reading in English will give these kids the opportunity to thrive both at home and in the outside world. As Lieutenant Governor, he witnessed the depressing reality of life in these communities. Alcohol and drug addictions and a terrible wave of teenage suicides. It was all too much for him to bear.
My aircraft landed and there was a plane waiting to taxi to take off. And there were a number of people sitting there. And I asked the chief what was going on, and he said a 13-year-old girl had killed herself. And they were taking the body away for an autopsy. And I said, well, why did she do it? And he said, because she had no hope. They feel that they're excluded from society because in the schools they were getting a terrible education. There were no books in the libraries, and they had no hope for the future.
Another motivation for Bartleman was his own native heritage, having grown up in an area where he felt discriminated against.
When I was growing up, the Native people were the marginal people of society. They still are. That marginalization was very strong and pronounced in this part of Ontario at that time. We were not really accepted in the village. Our first home was up by the village dump, but with all those disadvantages, there were also some great advantages, because living up by the village dump, I had access to all those great comic books that the rich tourists threw out. And actually, the Port Carling dump was my first library.
Young Bartleman grew hungry for more than comic books and soon found literature in the stacks of the local library.
I found that reading was the great leveler, that I was able to compete with the other kids because I knew how to read. And I developed a tremendous interest in reading, because reading allowed me to dream about other worlds, about having an existence other than the existence of my dad as a day laborer, hard life. And I was then able to take advantage of the opportunities that came along in life.
Bartleman went on to a distinguished career in Canada's diplomatic corps, serving as ambassador in Cuba, Bangladesh, South Africa, and Israel. His final posting was as Lieutenant Governor of Ontario. Bartleman used his position to gather millions of books for the First Nations communities.
A sample, we are getting 12,000 books, but these are books for little children. Okay? There's a book for you.
Citizens, the police, even the military helped create the first libraries for these children.
So kids, do you have books at home? Yeah. Do you ever heard of Club Amic?
His literacy camps have helped thousands of children learn how to read and give them what Bartleman himself needed to succeed beyond the reservation.
So where's Letitia?
Now when I go to the communities and talk to the nurses at the nursing stations, the nurses say that they see the children hanging around with books in their hands rather than just hanging around with stones in their hands or getting into trouble. I'm happy for them. I think it's a really great start.
I was getting all dressed up to go out, and then
Okay, did you have a chance? Okay.
Kaf.
Kaf. Can you tell me a word that begins with kaf?
Kajol.
Kajol. And kajol means?
Blue.
Go ahead.
While native languages have mostly disappeared, other ancient tongues have found strategies to survive.
Okay.
Here, Jewish children learn the letters of the Hebrew alphabet, ingesting letters written in honey as a sort of initiation into the shared memory of their culture.
You know what letter that is? Chet. What kind of sound does chet make? Ha. Okay. Leave some of the board there. Okay. What letter? Lamed. Very good. Okay. Okay, very good.
In schools like this one, the Jewish culture has been passed on from generation to generation. The slaves brought to the United States had no written language and were cruelly banned from learning to read and write.
Oh, when the saints go marching in, Oh, when the saints go marching in. Well,
Locals commemorate not only Lincoln's 1862 proclamation freeing the Confederacy slaves, but they also celebrate the president's trusted advisor, Frederick Douglass, an inspiration to future civil rights leaders such as Martin Luther King.
The life of the Negro is still sadly crippled by the manacles of segregation and the chains of discrimination. 100 years later,
King's oratory owes much to Douglass's speeches of nearly a century before.
Until the colored man's pathway to the American ballot box, North and South, shall be as smooth and as safe as the same for the white citizen, this discussion will go on. Until the American people shall make character and not color the criterion for respectability, this discussion will go on.
I am Frederick Douglass IV. I'm the great-great-grandson of Frederick Douglass through his son Frederick Jr., who had a son out of wedlock named Charles A. Douglass. My father's name is Frederick III, and I am Frederick.
Frederick Douglass IV shares his predecessor's belief in the value of reading, something he advocates when portraying his great-great-grandfather in schools.
I was born on the eastern shore of Maryland, not far from here, in Talbot County. I was born a slave. They sent me to Baltimore because Hugh Auld, another family member, needed a household servant. They put me on a boat with huge white billowing sails, and I floated up to Chesapeake, and when I arrived in Fells Point, Hugh Auld came and took me to his house on Philpott Street. And having felt the lash once or twice, I knew that I did not like to be beaten. So I did my chores faithfully.
What is that in your hand, and why are you looking at it so hard?
I'm reading. This is the Bible. Come and see.
Sophia Auld, she had never been involved with slavery, so she had none of the preconceptions of her husband. And she felt that there was nothing wrong with teaching a slave how to read, although it was illegal.
A.
She was very proud of what she was doing, and at some point in time, she told Hugh, and she was very proud of it. When Hugh found out, he was furious. He said, "You cannot teach a nigger to read." And he went on to explain that if he were to learn to read, that he would become useless to himself because he would have ambitions, he would have dreams, and he would know that there was something beyond slavery. And he forbade her to do any more teaching.
Bag?
Good.
I would have to say my great-great-grandfather was the founder of the civil rights movement. He read the Constitution and he found ideas that he could use as an argument against slavery. Other questions? Yes, sir.
What books did you read for inspiration?
Well, one of my favorite things to read about was constitutional law. I at first accepted what I was told, and I believed that the Constitution was a pro-slavery document. But as I read and reread and reread, then I started forming my own views, and that's one of the purposes of reading, to form your own thoughts. And so as I continued to read the Constitution, I came to find clauses in the Constitution which were anti-slavery, and I used that as a basis when I went to Abraham Lincoln and others to argue against slavery. As we sit here in front of the Lincoln Memorial, my great-great-grandfather's every step of his life was based on his reading. Ultimately, he came to the concept that once you learn to read, you'll be forever free, and that is something that he passed on to each and every person, especially the freed slaves, as they were trying to assimilate into the overall society.
So remember, we're thinking about the words as if they're little pieces.
Fitting in is an important motivation for learning to read. If by adulthood we can't read, we face a terrific challenge.
Your next word is the word variable. What's the word?
Variable.
Variable. What's the first part?
Very.
And the second part?
Able.
Variable. Okay, let's try to spell it. V-A-R-I-A-B-L-E. I lost a couple of you. What happened right there?
It's a Y. It was a Y. You changed it to an I. Because there's a consonant right beside it. It's the R.
In a wealthy society like Canada's, surprisingly, 1 in 6 adults cannot read a newspaper headline. Barbara Taylor is one of these people.
The first afternoon that Barb came into the class, I could tell that she was nervous. She kind of had that fight or flight thing going on, that part of her wanted to be here and part of her wanted to get out as fast as she could.
You gotta have your education. If you don't got that, then you might as well just stay at home, lock yourself in that bedroom, and forget that there's a world out there. 'Cause that's the way it's happened to me. I have to go downstairs to my cousin's house and ask her if she can help explain what this means with the mail. I don't understand it. When I was in school, they used to make fun of me because I was so slow. I couldn't catch up with the other kids. I just said, I gotta quit. And then finally, I decided it was time to go back and time to get what I want out of life.
We're gonna practice a few of them here together, okay?
Okay.
All right. Okay, so we're looking at some of these morphographs and trying to break them into pieces. So here we have our first word. What's that one? See if you can break it into little pieces.
Unrefillable.
Great, unrefillable. So what's the root word there?
Fill.
Fill, And then these other things are called affixes. So the what's that one mean?
Not.
And then what's that mean?
That you can't refill anything.
Well, the not would mean can't, but the part means again. So in this case, it's gonna mean fill again, right? If there was one word that comes to mind when I think about people developing their literacy skills, it's the word empowerment. When people are able to read for themselves, write for themselves, and make decisions, it seems to give them the strength to then take on the world.
I'm going to accomplish what my goal is, to prove to my family that I'm somebody. I'm not just some piece of trash out there. I'm somebody, and I'm going to prove it to everybody. Just writing to let you know how much I love you. You love me the same way that I love you. Love always, your wife, Barb.
learning to read may be for some a heroic journey. Most of us take it for granted that we will successfully master this skill that lets us read the world for ourselves. We have access to reading material all around us, in public libraries and on the internet. But what about the readers in antiquity? What challenges did they face, and how were these different from ours? To find out how different, we can examine the remains of Roman culture buried under the slopes of Mount Vesuvius. Here, archaeological discoveries have been sifted through for hundreds of years, looking for clues into the history of the ancient reading mind. The clues that are being examined come from this place, Herculaneum, a seaside retreat for wealthy Romans in the vicinity of Pompeii. Maria Paola Guiabaldi, director of the archaeological site here, tells us how the volcanic lava preserves some of reading's greatest treasures.
Nel 79 d.C. l'eruzione del Vesuvio distrusse Ercolano, Pompei e le altre città vesuviane. Questa immensa tragedia è però stata la fortuna di questi siti archeologici, perché si sono conservate queste città nella loro integrità, ferme in un momento preciso della loro storia e della loro vita.
Herculaneum was buried under 30 meters of lava for nearly 2,000 years, until in the 18th century, well diggers discovered marble statues almost everywhere they dug.
Nel 1738 Carlo di Borbone decise di intraprendere lo scavo sempre per cunicoli, per tunnel. Scavando queste gallerie venivano poi prese e portate in superficie le sculture, oppure tagliati pezzi di mosaici oppure pitture. Nel corso di questo scavo di gallerie furono portati in superficie non soltanto le sculture, ma i papiri, che però in un primo momento non furono riconosciuti in quanto tali, perché essendo carbonizzati non furono immediatamente, non si capì immediatamente la loro consistenza.
What these workers had stumbled upon was the library of a luxurious Roman villa now known as the Villa dei Papiri. Almost 2,000 years after the villa's rich owner perished with his library and his collection of statues, another wealthy patron of the arts, John Paul Getty, built an exact replica of the villa in Malibu, California. Here he housed his Roman and Greek antiquities, including statuary recovered from the ruins of Herculaneum.
The villa has never been properly excavated. It was only dug with vertical and horizontal shafts, using convicts, in fact, to dig things out. And we think that the villa belonged to Lucius Calpurnius Piso, who was Julius Caesar's father-in-law. And Piso and his circle, maybe even Caesar himself, would have walked in these colonnades in antiquity, talked about philosophy, politics, art, and culture. Libraries weren't the kind of circulating libraries we have today. They were for private study, but that meant private in groups. Books were read aloud, and of course they weren't books, but were scrolls that were unrolled as people would read them, and they would be read during meal times, during walks, and usually slaves or servants would do the reading while the masters would do the listening and contemplating. The library consists largely of papyrus of texts of the ancient philosopher Philodemus of Gadara, who was a follower of the Greek philosopher Epicurus. And it's highly probable that Philodemus would have even been an in-house philosopher for Piso, would have been with Piso and his comrades, pondering the great questions of the day.
Since their discovery, the papyri have been painstakingly studied in Naples by generations of experts who make annual pilgrimages to this room in the National Library. UCLA professors Catherine Atherton and David Blank have both been coming here to work for decades in an effort to unravel the mysteries of the scrolls. They even met and fell in love here in the papyri room.
I benefit tremendously from having David as someone who is so knowledgeable about the papyrus. It's wonderful.
For both of us, it's very advantageous to have this way of studying separately together.
Mm. Oh, that's very Epicurean. Syzetesis.
Yes.
Where two go together, one sees before the other.
As Aristotle quoted from Homer. I first looked at this passage here on the 21st of July in 2000, and then I left it aside to work on later portions for a while, and I've come back to it this summer. So altogether, I'd say, just to decipher this piece of papyrus, it has taken me about 5 weeks' work.
The Epicurean texts have been influential for more than 2,300 years. Epicurus wrote more than 300 works, but this fragment of his book, On the Nature of Things, is only one of a handful of texts that survive. There's something about the nature of Epicurean reading that we've been able to discern from the scrolls. The Epicureans sent letters of instructions to their schools in order to exert tight control over how followers interpreted the works of the master.
And it's thought that this kind of letter writing, in order to keep discipline and to keep the doctrinal continuity of the school in its various places, may have served as a kind of model to the pastoral letters that are written by the Apostle St. Paul to various of the Christian churches.
Discoveries about the history of written language turn up everywhere in the scrolls.
This is a work by one of the greatest philosophers of antiquity, of whom almost no one has ever heard, Chrysippus. He wrote something over 300 books at his papyrus rolls. But unfortunately, of all of those books, we have legible fragments of just one of them, this one, the one that I'm reading.
This might be the first modern grammar book outlining the philosophies that form the foundation of modern grammar that we use today.
The papyrus rolls are written in a certain way. They're written in capital letters without separations between the words, and with very few marks of punctuation, which is one reason why it takes someone with special training actually to be able to read them aloud fluently.
Reading a book in antiquity was extremely difficult. It required a lot of manual dexterity to keep the thing extended before you at the right place, rolled up in one hand, rolled up in the other. And of course, at the end, it was like rewinding the videotape.
Readers in antiquity must have grown tired of this troublesome technology. Within a few centuries, a more efficient book had found its way into the reader's hands, which, like its predecessor, was also read aloud. Here, in the 4th century, a man who was to become one of history's greatest teachers, St. Augustine, saw something that would change reading forever. One day, while visiting the monastery, Augustine saw the elderly St. Ambrose reading and described what he saw. While his eyes scanned the page and his heart sought out the meaning, his voice was silent and his tongue was still. When we came to visit him, we found him reading like this in silence, for he never read aloud. Readers could now digest the text in their minds, free of the constraints of reading aloud. By the 9th century, reading silently was common practice. Learning to read silently meant that you could keep your thoughts to yourself. But by the 18th century, some thinkers saw the private mind of readers as an unsafe and unhealthy place.
Mein Herr, can I ask you a very personal question? Do you have problems with your bowels?
No, I don't.
What about feelings of melancholy?
Sometimes, yes.
Sometimes.
In wintertime.
What about arthritis?
No.
Apoplexy. Do you suffer from apoplexy, sir?
Monsieur,
Yes.
do you read a wide variety of material?
Yes, I do.
Then do not listen to this man.
I will not.
Do not listen to this. What he talks is rubbish.
Yes, yes.
You agree with me?
Yes, I agree.
And what about you, ladies and gentlemen? Do you agree that it is rubbish?
I cannot listen to this. No, I cannot listen.
The 18th century scientist J.G. Heinzmann expounded his theory that reading is bad for your health.
To her, so she becomes completely and utterly idle. Her brain is not working. She develops the melancholy of the brain. She thinks that her whole world is revolving round the work in the book, and she realizes that that is not so.
Monsieur!
So she becomes depressed.
I must stop you there, monsieur.
Stop me there, I don't care.
No man has the right. No man is given the right to preach to the people.
On the other hand, Denis Diderot, a leading 18th century liberal thinker, believed in bibliotherapy, reading that could cure us of our ailments.
You all know, you all have the right to read, to learn. How can reading be bad for you? Art is there. It must promote virtue. It must not dictate morals. Move me, astonish me, astound me. Make me shudder, but do not dictate morals to me, monsieur.
The dangers of reading can cause many, many, many different kind of complications. We can start with the fact that excessive reading or an addiction to reading can cause colds. Yes, colds. How many of you had colds? Yeah? Many, many of you have had the cold. How many of you also do the reading? Many, many read.
This is a ridiculous argument, monsieur. My own wife.
Confusion as to the physiological effects of reading has persisted throughout history because we still don't completely understand how the brain reads. Reading starts with sight. The ancients knew this much, and they constantly debated how we perceive things. Considering this question, the ancient Greeks were divided into two camps. Euclid argued that we send rays out of us to apprehend the observed object. Philodemus, like Epicurus before him, believed that our eyes perceived the world in the opposite way.
Visual perception for us typically involves three things. There's an object, and there's light, and then there's the sense organ which is attached to the brain. For the Epicureans, they would accept this, but they would include something else. They thought that we perceive objects visually insofar as objects emit effluxes, very fine layers of atoms, a single atom thick, which are constantly emitted by three-dimensional objects, so that there is a physical chain of contact between object and perceiver.
No one could resolve this debate for centuries. Did readers reach out and capture letters on a page, or did the letters travel back to us? More than 1,000 years after the debate began, the answer was found in the halls of the Al-Aqsa Mosque in Cairo. Working inside his small apartment above the mosque's entrance, the greatest scientist of the first millennium, Ibn al-Haytham, solved the mystery of how we perceive things. The mosque's university in Cairo had flung its doors open to thinkers from all disciplines, interested in advancing all kinds of knowledge.
Ibn al-Haytham made some sort of a paradigm shift. He gave us a new paradigm that totally eclipsed the other earlier
paradigm concerning optics. His alma mater, his book of optics, is considered to be one of the most important works in the history of science. And he proposed a new theory, which is called the intromission theory, which states that it's not the eyes that emit rays, but it's the objects in the outside world that are the sources of our perception.
Al-Haytham also distinguished between the pure sensation of seeing a beautiful vista and perception, the voluntary act of recognition that we need to accomplish in order to read a text on a page. Al-Haytham knew that this recognition of a text was done in the brain, but he didn't know how it happened. To this day, we are still trying to answer Al-Haytham's questions about how the brain reads. Neurolinguists have helped us begin to understand the relationship between the brain and language, but mysteries about the reading brain persist. Studying the brains of people like the Canadian novelist Howard Engel may unlock further secrets.
I've always been a reader. I guess I've taken it for granted that I was hardwired to being a reader, so that I had no warning about going to bed one day and waking up the following morning only to discover that I couldn't read. What happened was I got up in the morning, ordinary day, the bed looked like the bed, the window looked like the window, everything was in its proper place. I walked down the stairs, opened the front door, picked up the newspaper on the step, and when I opened it up and looked at it, it seemed to be written in Serbo-Croatian or Cyrillic or something that was foreign. I looked at the inside pages, and they were in the same kind of language. The letters were not the customary letters that I'm familiar with. Immediately I thought, oh, somebody's having me on. It's a joke. It's some prank of a friend. But when I went in and found that the books on my shelves seemed to be written in the same language, everything in print looked different. Then I was certain that I'd had a stroke overnight.
The incredible thing is that although Engel can write just as fast as ever, he needs the help of friends to read anything from newspapers to his own work.
Lorenzo, who was happier with a blackened face and a mandolin than he is with a pen and a ledger book.
A mandolin. I hope the mandolin had been invented by then.
That foolish merchant, Antonio, has the other half of my pen.
Slide down a little bit towards your feet, just a touch. That's good.
Dr. Mark Joannis is a neuroscientist using the latest tools to study brains like Howard Engel's. Joannis is unraveling the mystery of the reading brain, the same question that fascinated ancient Greeks and Arabs.
Written language is really different in the sense that it's a cultural innovation that humans created, rather than something that nature gave to humans. So even though we're all born to learn to talk or learn language in some form, we're not necessarily born to read. You don't learn to read until you're 4 or 5 years old. When you finally do learn to read, it takes 2 or 3 years for you to actually gain some proficiency. It develops really slowly, and it's because we're sort of shoehorning it into our brain. Our brain isn't really wired for reading. We've kind of got to push our brain to actually do this actually very hard thing of associating the language that we know with the visual representation of that language.
You're going to hear some loud knocking again. This is for 4.5 minutes. Just try to keep very still. Here we go. You're doing a great job. Pictures are really nice.
We're really interested in how the brain reads because we're interested in how we go from the sounds of the words in our head to writing those words down on a page. Those things are not the same thing. And they're all gonna curl up and say goodnight. Oops, you missed a page. But we learn those sounds of words and we learn the meanings of words long before we actually learn how to read those words. So we know what a cat is, and we know the words cat, and we know k, a, and t. But only later in life do we actually associate the C and the A and the T on the page with the cat sound in your head. The way that we learn to read is by coordinating as if it was an orchestra, these different instruments in our brain, all scattered around different parts of our brain, and bringing them together, associating them with each other. And that's how the brain actually reads, not by lighting up just one part of the brain, but instead by bringing these all together, by bringing together the visual form of the word, the C, A, and T in cat, and the sounds k, a, t, which are stored in a different part of the brain, and the meaning of cat. And bringing all those things together, that is reading. And reading can break down when any one of those pieces of the puzzle falls apart. So we've taken two pictures of your brain here, but let's look at this one here first.
So this is my brain.
And over here on the left hemisphere, which I'll highlight in red now, is the part of your left hemisphere that's had a stroke. And we can see that both the occipital region here, that's the visual center, and parts of the temporal region, which is like the semantic center, have become disconnected from each other.
When the doctors told me that I had alexia synagraphia, that is, the inability to read without affecting my ability to write, it seemed as if they were saying to me, the right foot had to be amputated by noon, but I could keep the shoe and the sock. It just seemed to be an unequal kind of bargain.
I'll just flash them up on the screen, and you just tell me what you see.
Okay. And so, a seal, a boat.
What's happened is that the more visual aspects of his brain have become disconnected from the meaning and sound centers of the brain. He can look at the picture of a cat and say that that's a cat and tell you all about it. But when you show him the letters that make up cat, it takes a little bit more effort to actually read that.
Candle. Beaker. Orchestra. Sure. Now that's got me totally buffaloed.
So we've taken two pictures of your brain here, but let's look at this one here first.
Is the cognitive process different for the reader of pictographic languages than for Westerners like Howard Engel who scan lines of letters? Mastering an entire pictographic language is a gigantic task that can take a lifetime to accomplish.
So come on this way. Okay, Victoria, Olivia, we'll start the experiment here. You'll sit in this chair and Eric will put one of these caps on your head and it measures the electricity that your brain naturally makes.
I'm gonna need you to close your eyes, just because these can end up in your eyes and that would not be fun. You ready?
Dr. Charles Perfetti is one of a worldwide team of researchers looking into how a pictographic reader's brain might work when reading Chinese.
Victoria's reading Chinese words, and she's going to read English words as well. And we're trying to learn about whether the brain has different reactions to Chinese compared with English. And because Victoria knows both, that will be a very meaningful comparison. We think there are some differences just because of the way they look and the way the writing works for the two different languages. These areas that I've got indicated in orange are areas that are added when one reads Chinese. This frontal area, for example, seems to be unique in supporting the reading of Chinese. It seems to be responsible for memory for the characters.
We may be successfully mapping what areas of the brain are activated when reading any language, but there is still one big unanswered question about the reading brain.
We've learned a lot about the parts of the brain that support pronunciation, parts of the brain that are useful for meaning. What needs to be discovered in more detail is the rest of the story, how those areas get put together. What about the connections? So when those pathways are identified, we will know more about the details of how the system works as a whole system, not just a bunch of areas that get activated.
For scientists like Charles Perfetti and Mark Schwanese, understanding how we read may help identify and assist those whose brains have trouble reading. They know that reading problems in childhood may have serious consequences later in life.
Dog. Stove.
One thing we see is that in typically developing children, when they see a picture of a word and hear that word, we get an electrical response that happens about a half second after they hear the word. Dyslexic children show about a 50 millisecond delay. That's just the blink of an eye of difference in recognizing when the sound of a word that they hear doesn't match the picture that they saw on the screen. That 50 millisecond difference reliably distinguishes the dyslexic children in our study from the typical readers.
Wheel.
The kind of treatment that we might hope to give these kids has to do with tuning their brains into the sounds of words. Dyslexic children are the most likely to benefit from this kind of phonological awareness or phonics training. Oh, you want the baby? The baby book? Okay. Why don't you sit with Mom and we'll read the baby book. We know that reading ability predicts how well you're going to do at school. And of course, how well you do at school predicts whether you're going to get into college or university, what kind of jobs you're going to do later in life, and so on, what part of cities you're even going to live in. All of these things start to have these cascading effects.
Fly guy flew in until he saw something, and he whatever.
Having difficulty with something as basic as reading or communication predisposes you to all kinds of difficulties later in life. Problems with mental health, problems with depression, problems with drug addiction, and they all stem from a very basic deficit in how you were learning to read in school.
Best of all, Buzz made him feed him.
You have to get the kids young. Once the kids tune in to reading, they have it for life. But after the age of 8 or 9, the chances of them ever getting a good education are very poor. So come on and show me your pups. Look at that, eh?
There's four girls and 2 boys.
Is that right? We got 4 dogs at home, so I better not stay around.
Gerald Bunting is an example of what James Bartleman has been able to accomplish in these communities.
Boy, my wife would go crazy, but she would love it. What's that?
Citizenship for, and when I was in grade 2 and 3, 2005, I was always helpful. Most improved student, grade 4, 2006. Most improved student again.
Do you want to try reading a little bit for us? What's the name of the book?
Adventures with Ribbit and Bear Paws. Prepared to be amazed at my... Hee. That was amazing. How does greatness taste? A little gritty. Want to try some? Well, how does greatness taste? You were right. It was gritty. Greatness needs maple sugar.
Yeah. So, and this is a book about Ojibwe people, isn't it?
Yeah, but...
And you're an Ojibwe person, an Anishinaabe.
Look, this guy.
Yeah. I think that my story is a story that any kid who is exposed to the magic of books can also experience. I think that books are the key to self-fulfillment. They're a key to being a good citizen. They're a key to getting a good job, all those things. And it can happen to anybody.
Learning to read unlocks a whole new world for us, allowing us to step outside time to make contact with authors who lived centuries ago in places far away. It's our passport to a fulfilled life, and it fully justifies the struggle.